Good morning. Welcome back to the Broadcast Retirement Network. I'm Jeff Snyder. This is BRN Sunday for Sunday, April 25th, 2021. We've got a great show for you today. I'm going to be joined by members of the media, academia, and financial services as we analyze all the news this week in retirement markets, technology, personal finance, so much more. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of BRN Sunday. Let's kick things off with a look at healthcare. Joining us online, she's the healthcare editor for Business Insider, and she's also the editor of Dispensed, a weekly aggregation analysis of all the healthcare news. Talking about Lydia Ramsey Flanzer. Lydia, so great to talk to you. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So a lot going on. Taking a look at the pages of Dispensed, or electronic pages of Dispensed, I should add. A lot going on in the healthcare industry. Where'd you want to start?
Sure. I think the biggest, most pressing thing right now is the CDC is meeting currently with a group of advisors to discuss Johnson & Johnson's vaccine. So we should know by this weekend whether or not we're going to have this vaccine back available to Americans or if it'll remain paused for the time being.
So in terms of J&J, and this, I think it was over a week ago, right? They kind of pulled it, I don't know, off the shelves is definitely not the right metaphor, but they pulled it out of circulation. I think they had found some side effects with some people or some health issues with some of the people that took it.
Yeah. So there seemed to be a problem of case popping up of people who really rare blood clot. This blood clot that's like a very specific kind of blood clot, different than a typical one. Not that all blood clots aren't scary. But it was happening in groups of people who had recently, in like the past 2 or 3 weeks, gotten the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And we've seen similar kind of rare blood clots popping up in relation to AstraZeneca's vaccine, which is available in Europe currently. And so it gave regulators a lot of room to think like, oh, shoot, maybe we should take a step back and figure this all out. Yeah, so far there was an update today as part of the advisory meeting that 15 women developed those clots. I think there were 2 deaths associated with this, and so yeah, it was definitely a good thinking to pause it and take a step back. But now the big question is, how do we bring it back? Do we have a warning on there for women under 50? All these cases were for those people in that kind of age group and women in particular. Or do we just let it go back and just say, hey, this is a thing that could happen? So we'll have to see what the advisors decide.
Any timetable when is that supposed to be today? We're talking on Friday, of course, Friday afternoon. Friday afternoon my time and early morning Lydia's time. But is that something that we'll hear about today, or is that probably as soon as next week?
Yeah, it should be coming up. So the meeting is happening right now as we're chatting. But the vote will happen later today on what kind of recommendations this group wants to pull out together of, should we limit this in women under 50, like should they not get this vaccine? Or should we just make it still available to everyone? That's kind of the big question on my mind is what kind of restrictions go in place. We should know their recommendations later today. And so by this weekend, we might know whether or not the vaccine is unpaused. Right now, it's still not being distributed. I think about 8 million shots were actually administered before the pause went into effect about a week and a half ago.
Yeah, Lydia, in terms of in general with the vaccines, and I know when we chatted with you 2 weeks ago, the variants still, I think there's now a Brazil variant, if I'm not mistaken. There are all these different names. I'm not too good with following it, but these variants are kind of popping up. Have you heard anything related to adapting the vaccines to meet this new demand to challenge these variants? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, for sure. So we still don't totally know if, these vaccines are going to hold up against the variants. We now know we have about 6 months worth of data showing that both Pfizer and Moderna's mRNA vaccines, they're highly effective. So that's great news to see, especially since that 6 months includes some of the time when variants were spreading in the U.S. The variant that initially got spotted in the UK is now kind of the dominant strain here in the U.S. So the big hope is like, hopefully these vaccines work against the variants. We just don't really know. So yeah, to kind of counteract that and make sure that we're crossing all our T's and dotting all our I's. I think both Moderna and Pfizer have started trials on booster shots. This idea of, okay, you've gotten 2 doses of Moderna's vaccine or Pfizer's vaccine. Here's a third that you should take. And this should help combat the variant. Those are undergoing clinical trials right now. We should get data from them soon-ish. But yeah, it kind of is this big question in our heads of, okay, so are we going to get a new shot every year, kind of like we do for flu? I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case, but part of me is hoping, okay, cool, maybe we can get vaccines to really wipe this virus out completely on the first go around.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you don't want to have to be taking a shot every year. I mean, unless you are not immune or have not taken it in the past. And in terms of clinical trials, I mean, how does that typically work? This is obviously a unique circumstance, but in a typical case, when you do clinical trials, what's the pool of trials? I mean, is it 10,000, 1,000, a million? Do you have a sense for what that typically looks like?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a pretty smaller trial. It's going to include people. The one that's undergoing, I know from Moderna, includes people who have were part of earlier trials. So they're drawing from similar groups of people who have been really closely studied since getting their initial shots. Mm-hmm. But I'd have to check as to how big this would be. I don't believe it's huge, like tens of thousands, like the late stage trials were. I think the initial ones are looking at smaller groups. Because that's kind of the hope is like, can we get more vaccines online even quicker than we did this first go around? Now that we've kind of seen that for the most part, the bones of this are safe and effective.
Yeah. I want to switch gears. There was a story in today's, or I think maybe last week's Dispense, I'm not sure, about, mental health is such a big issue now. I think we learned a lot through the pandemic about quarantining and loneliness and the impact on mature Americans, but also, and not just Americans, but mature people, as well as younger generation, people my age, people your age, and school-age kids. But a lot of work is being done by startups in mental health. And I think you spoke to one this past week or last week. Any thoughts there about mental health and that focus now for healthcare providers and healthcare technologists?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we've seen a lot of startups kind of hitting their stride this past year. You've seen a bunch kind of telemedicine solutions overall go public, and some of them have really strong mental health presences. One story we covered this week was about this one startup that is trying to kind of imbue group therapy and more preventive mental health care. So you might not have a full-blown diagnosis of I've got severe anxiety or I've got severe depression. You might just want someone to talk to. People are building apps for people like that, and it's different than sometimes there's chatbots available and quick little things that can help you. But the idea of this would be to have conversations with therapists, with others, and really have the space to talk about it. Mm-hmm. I was thinking of it the other day as kind of like Clubhouse, but for chatting about mental health topics in particular. But it's pretty cool to see all the different solutions people are coming up with, now that we're not really beholden to being in person and sitting right next to each other. What can we do with that? Can we make therapy cheaper? Can we come up with new ideas that can help people, avoid burnout or find ways to cope with what's a serious crisis but still quite undergoing it. So it's definitely interesting.
And I think it's refreshing. I'll just give my personal point of view. It's refreshing that we're talking about mental health. It's not, it's something I think kind of skirted. I think over the last few years it's become more talked about, but I think, when I was growing up, it was kind of skirted or kind of pushed aside. And it's nice to see that, hey, this happens to a lot of people, not just a certain segment of the population. People have mental health issues all the time. Can have mental health issues at different times of their lives, and it's important to kind of deal with this. So, any thoughts there in terms of how this is kind of, I think the pandemic in a good way, if there can be a good that comes from this in terms of vaccine development, but also addressing mental health care, seems to be a really positive step.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think it's cool to see conversations becoming a lot more frank about it. You know, you can have people chatting with one another. Like I've talked to people about, oh, I'm trying this thing and I'm going to do this. I know for me, I've kind of started to imbue some tactics into my own life to keep me feeling good. So it's definitely a good time.
Yeah, all of us have. All of us have. Well, Lydia, it's always a pleasure chatting with you. I want to wish you a great weekend. Thanks so much for stopping by, and we look forward to having you back on in a few weeks. Welcome back, and now we're going to talk technology. Joining us on the line, he's lead advisor, executive producer for Seven Investing, talking about Daniel Klein. Dan, great to see you, or hear you, I guess, in this case. Thanks so much for joining us on the program this morning.
Good morning, Jeff.
Pleasure always chatting with you. Some big news this week, a lot of big news we're going to get to. The first is Netflix, I think, released some subscriber numbers a little below or a lot below what the expected numbers were. Sorry.
This shows you how little most investors and certainly many financial journalists understand numbers. So for the past year, Netflix has been warning us that because they'd had such good numbers where every quarter they were beating their subscriber numbers, that at some point that would catch up to them, that they had pulled forward those numbers. And that's essentially what happened this quarter. They missed by a few million customers on subscribers. They beat on revenue. They beat on profit. They announced that they're going to start a $5 billion stock buyback, which I'm not in favor of. But very clearly, they had a really good quarter. And the idea that you would take this to mean, oh, hey, subscriptions are going to slow down. The reality is, if you're in a subscription business, would you rather, if you're going to add 20 million people in 2 years, would you rather they all signed up on day one and paid for 2 years, or would you rather they were split up evenly? Of course, you'd rather they sign up early. And that's what happened with Netflix. The pandemic forced people looking for entertainment to subscribe early, and they took some of their growth from this quarter. It happened over the past 3 or 4 quarters. There is nothing to worry about here, yet the stock is down about 10% since they reported.
Dan, I want to go back on something you said and kind of break it down for the audience, because I think there's a lack of understanding about how people consume streaming, how people consume content. Because you really alluded to this. People don't all sign up on day one. They don't watch all the content of a particular program or programs on day one. A lot of times people do things piecemeal, and I'm sure you can share some of your experiences. Dan, do you watch a show in full all the way through, meaning show 1 through 22 of a season or whatever the season is? Maybe it's 8 in Netflix. But people kind of parse that out, right? They do it over a period of time. They don't just binge watch the whole episode or even the whole series in one day.
This to me is the biggest mistake Netflix makes. So Netflix releases almost all of its shows on here's the entire season on the same day basis. Why is this a mistake? Because by putting things out on an episodic once a week basis, you're allowing for a better news cycle. So that doesn't matter for lesser shows on Netflix. But if you have a new season of Stranger Things, basically you get a bunch of hype in the first week and then it disappears. And you also lose the water cooler because people at work don't know, what have you seen? Have you watched it? Can I talk about this? Whereas, I'm watching Falcon and Winter Soldier. I think you may be as well. And there's kind of an unspoken rule with my coworkers that you have to watch it over the weekend. It releases on Friday, and on Monday we're going to talk about it. But all of the pop culture and entertainment sites can do multiple stories, like what's going to be in the episode, what questions does it have to answer, and then follow-up content. Was it good? Did it answer it? Was it satisfying? So I consume content like it's traditional television. I generally watch things, if it's something I really want to watch, 1 week at a time. And then I tend to have other shows, which maybe are shows that my wife doesn't want to watch, which maybe I'll be watching, say like The Flash, a show my wife doesn't watch. Yeah, maybe it's 10 episodes into the season before I start watching, and 3 or 4 nights a week after she goes to bed, I'll watch. I think the idea that there's this like mass binging is maybe a little bit overspoken. I still think a lot of people like episodic television and sort of spreading the pleasure out, especially when it's something they really enjoy.
And Dan, just to kind of follow up on that, and then we'll move to the next topic, which is, let's talk about podcasts. Let's talk about episodic, things like this, things like BRN, other, people may listen to something today, or they may go back to it and search for it. So having it available 24/7, searchable by topic, using metadata allows somebody, not everyone consumes everything the same way. That's really the benefit of these types of platforms, right? Because you don't have to consume it all like you would linear TV and wait for the rerun. I mean, of course we have DVR, right? But this is really the benefit, and a lot of people do consume things in pieces, piecemeal.
Yeah, I don't watch anything when it's actually on, with the possible exception of some sports. And even with sports, I try to not watch the first like 20 minutes so I can fast forward through commercials. But that means, of course, having to avoid your phone because you might get a score update in real time that can ruin your experience. But that being said, I know that like my podcast habits tend to be varied. So I have some shows I really like to listen to. Like I love to listen to the Press Box on the Ringer Network, which is sort of a media podcast. And I tend to listen to that pretty much when it's released on my daily walk. I take a couple of mile walk in my neighborhood. But there are other shows that I let pile up. And today I have, a 3-hour drive. I'm heading from West Palm Beach to the Orlando area. And I'll listen to 2 or 3 different podcasts on that trip. And I'll do the same on the way home. So I know for me, I don't really listen to podcasts sitting around the house. So maybe occasionally when I'm cooking or something. But it's one of those scenarios where time and availability is what comes down to it. And yeah, something like BRN, I might say, okay, like I haven't been available, but now I have a bunch of time, so maybe I'll watch 3 episodes in a row, or 3 out of 4 that I'm listening to.
Yeah, I think that's that consuming habit. It's so flexible with these streaming platforms. I think if you're a conventional analyst or a conventional person, maybe you kind of miss out on some of these trends. All right, Dan, let's talk about some other big news this week. Apple had its spring event, some new iPads, iPad Pros, some devices, I think a new iMac. Get your take on that.
Yeah, I thought it was mostly underwhelming. So the new iMacs, Apple's moving all of its devices to its M1 processor, and there will be benefits of that going, with iPhone apps working on Macs and things like that. But that was kind of inevitable. And the big development is they're thinner and they're available in different colors. And I understand that Apple considers its devices like fashion as much as anything, but I don't care if I can get an iMac in, rose gold or whatever it is. I will say I'm a little annoyed that I spent, I don't know, $1,600 on a new iMac less than 6 months ago, and now there's a much better, thinner, cooler model. So that's coloring, my thoughts. But I thought the really interesting device that they put out is the AirTag. And at first, I was underwhelmed. So AirTag works with Apple's Find My. If you have an iPhone or a Mac and you turn on Find My and you lose your phone, you can track it on anybody you've shared that info with. So my son once lost his phone on the Men in Black ride at Universal Studios, and I went to a cast member or a crew member, whatever they call them at Universal Studios, and I showed them where the phone was, and they went in and got it. It's like, so you'll be able to put those tags on your wallet, your keys, wherever you want. And at first I thought, well, isn't this just tile? But the network works based on having an available signal to bounce off of. Apple has 1 billion iPhones out there in the market. So that makes its network able to do things that other networks can't do. So that part I was impressed with. But this was really just an Apple product refresh. They put out a new iPad Pro. For me, I don't understand who the iPad Pro is for. It costs almost as much as a laptop.
Yeah.
And it's basically just a big phone. And I've added a keyboard to an iPad. That's not a particularly satisfying experience. So, again, they don't usually introduce their most interesting things in the fall, in the spring. So it's usually the fall when the best stuff comes out. So largely underwhelming, but, definitely evolutionary in moving Apple's products forward.
Let's talk about the M1 for a second, because they migrated all of their, they got away from Intel chips. I think Intel really, by the way, has really taken a step back. I think AMD with the Ryzen chip really taking things to the next level, putting a lot of pressure on Intel. But this M1 I was going to say M1 trip, but the M1 chip, and especially in the iPad, and I saw it's in the iPad Pro, allows you to bump up a lot of power there, in comparatively to your iMac or other similar devices.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Apple has done a great job in doing something that very, very few companies can do. Like, there's a reason most companies source chips from Intel or AMD. Apple has the customer base to do this, and they engineered a chip designed for their ecosystem. And now they're rolling it out to more devices, and eventually it will be all their devices. And it does. It makes your iPad more powerful. It makes it easier to integrate across the Apple system. Eventually, you won't have different app stores, or you might have some things that work better in some forms than others. But this is really a strength of tying the entire Apple universe together.
Dan, last question, not related to Apple or streaming. Semiconductors. I was out looking at vehicles, and I found out that the company I was looking at was not producing cars this month because there is a lag in the production of chips. And then we talked to Jacob Passy last week from MarketWatch. Same thing with appliances. Can't get appliances now that have chips in it. What are your thoughts about this deficit of semiconductor?
Yeah, it's a national crisis. It's something that, without getting political, that the president is trying to address in his infrastructure bill. We need more U.S.-based capacity to build semiconductors. I don't pretend I understand what a semiconductor is or what this space is, but you don't want to be reliant on importing something so important. And we are going to see shortages. We're going to see used vehicle prices go higher. We're going to see new vehicles go more scarce. It's a real shortage, and there's no actual answer as to sort of when this will recover.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting, and you make a good point, and the same thing I think would be probably be said about healthcare and medicines, right? A lot of bring some of the medicine production home as well. Totally different topic. Dan Klein, we're going to leave it there. It is always a pleasure chatting with you, and want to wish you a wonderful weekend. Have a safe trip up to Orlando. I think you said
Up to.
up to Orlando. I took geography in 8th grade, but candidly, I'm just not that good at it. Have a great rest of the weekend. We'll talk to you again soon, my friend.
I will see you soon, Jeff.
Welcome back. Now time to talk real estate. Joining us on the line, he's the real estate reporter for MarketWatch. I'm talking about Mr. Jacob Passy. Jacob, so great to talk to you. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Glad to be here.
So, what's happening in the real estate world? Not much, right?
Oh yeah, no, nothing at all. Just completely at a full standstill. No, actually, it's crazy competitive. We've been talking about that for weeks, but it seems like some people are starting to get nervous about the state of the housing market. So, looking at Google search trend data, breakout search in recent weeks was for the question, when will the housing market crash? According to Google, searches for that term or that phrase have risen over 2,000% in recent weeks.
Wow.
So, to the highest levels since 2004. I think, it makes sense, and so I decided to explore that question, get an answer for folks. Of course, your hindsight is 2020, but looking to try to predict the future is hardly perfect. But
Yep.
I reached out to experts to get their take on what's going on in the housing market right now and whether we're in for another bubble, because it's reasonable. The memories of the Great Recession are still strong and fresh in people's minds, and the housing crash that was associated with that. There are probably folks out there who lost their homes to foreclosure, but have been able to, repair their credit and get back into home ownership. We know that's happened. So, there are lots of factors why people might be nervous this time around. And, they're probably looking at what's going on right now. The market seems crazy competitive. It is. Prices are rising astronomically in some cases. There's just tons and tons of people wanting to buy homes left and right. So is it a repeat? And the good answer is, according to most experts I've spoken with so far, the answer is probably not. So, I don't think anyone's going to say definitively because, we don't want to, after a lot of people were burned with making bad predictions last time around, you don't necessarily want to do that again. But, the fact of the matter is that, we're in a very different world today than we were, a decade and a half ago.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we're not going to have the same financial crisis that we had in 2008 as we had during the Great Depression. Things aren't going to be an exact mirror image. Um, Jacob, I mean, it's really hard to predict the future. It is impossible to predict the future unless you're in the Minority Report, right? That was a great movie with Tom Cruise. They had the three, I don't know, three. Well, I just remember three women being able to predict the future and who was going to be, part of the crime syndicate. But in all seriousness, I think markets go up, markets go down. Right now seems to be a very, challenging time in terms of inventory. You talked about that last week there's a $4 million home difference between what the demand is versus what the supply. That tends to drive up the price. But the reality is, Jacob, we're not going to have the same exact, the securitization of these loans. Remember, they were divided into different tranches. Excuse me.
Right.
I think that issue, unless I'm mistaken, has been kind of put to bed.
Totally. So that's one of the big factors is, first off, lenders, are not making the risky loans they made back in that era. I mean, folks who, were, around then and thinking, who owned homes or were buying homes probably remember, the no doc mortgages where you basically didn't have to prove your income or anything. That is, far in the past. New regulations make it such that lenders have to be much more careful. They have to do really diligent underwriting to, approve loans right now. On top of that, a lot of lenders have actually made it even harder to get a mortgage since the pandemic started because of the economic issues associated with that. So they, added their own, requirements on top of what regulations require and what, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac might require. Mm-hmm. So that's one factor. And then the other thing is we're not seeing a lot of the other kinds of risky behaviors that were about during that era. So because it was so easy to get a mortgage in, the early 2000s, you saw home builders building whole communities of homes before a single one had even sold. Speculative building was happening all across the country. I lived in Florida at the time, and right next to my subdevelopment, they had built an entire subdevelopment of townhomes, and they then sat there vacant. And, even though sometimes you saw long lines of people waiting to see the model homes and stuff like that in the early 2000s, oftentimes those people were buying for investment properties. They weren't planning on living in them because of the easy access to mortgage credit. So that's not happening this time around either. Builders, the new home sales report came out on Friday, and we saw a huge surge. And when you look at, the breakdown, most of the homes that people are buying aren't even under construction yet. So people are buying, that speaks to the shortage that we're dealing with right now. Builders have so much demand just trying to get people into homes who need a home, given the shortage we've had, that they're not even worrying about building speculatively, homes that haven't been sold yet, really. So it's a very different world, and because of these fundamentals, we also have such strong demand. And as you and I have talked about, millennials are in their peak home buying years. The pandemic has caused people to reassess things. So the demand is so strong and the supply is so limited that the fundamentals are there for the prices we're seeing. They are supported by organic factors, not being, the demand is not being artificially increased because of, loose lending and things like that. This is all not to say, though, that there might not be parts of the country that might be in a bubble. And that's one caution that, most economists will give is what's going on at the national level may not be reflective of what's going on in your market. So a great example is New York City. New York City, the housing market here is still softer than it was pre-pandemic. Some of that is obviously related to the pandemic because people, fled the city, quote unquote. I think that's a little overstated as far as a trend, but certainly, there is more demand in the suburbs than in, the urban core, as it were. Some of that stuff was probably already happening. We already know that pre-pandemic, people were leaving cities like New York and San Francisco because of the high home prices. So certain markets like that may see a bit more of a correction than others. But also the other thing to keep in mind is, prices may fall, but that also doesn't mean that the market is crashing. If prices drop 5-10%, I mean, it certainly will sting if you are trying to sell your home at that time and not seeing as big of an investment as you wanted. But that's not the same thing as, the bottom falling out on the market. So, I don't think, New York is going to see the bottom fall out. I don't think San Francisco is going to either, but they may see a bit of a correction.
Yeah. Jacob, just kind of backing up at the macro, I guess, perspective. People are skittish, often skittish. They're shaped. Their position, their biases are shaped by what's happened to them. There's a whole group of people that have view through things through the lens of 2008, and so therefore they're going understandably they're going to be skittish. How do you overcome that? I'm just asking you this, maybe not as necessarily as a reporter, just generally, or a journalist, excuse me. But general thoughts about kind of overcoming these. Is it just going through just going through the process again and knowing that it's not happening, and to reaffirm and say, hey, my biases are no longer warranted and this is a new paradigm?
I think, the education is what's important there. So I think that, because I write my weekly advice column, and, I'm getting tons of questions of people who are nervous right now, or people looking to take advantage. They're eager. They're not nervous. They're the opposite. They're optimistic. They're saying, hey, I think I might be able to sell and lock it, get out of my investment now, and I can just rent, et cetera. People are trying to time the market, basically. I think educating yourself is really important. Know what's going on in your particular market. Mm-hmm. Look at how fast homes are selling. Look at, the vacancy rate for homes in your area. Are there a lot of homes that are sitting vacant? If that's the case, maybe your market is in a bit more of a bubble, because that was a big indicator during the last housing bubble, was that lots of homes were bought, but no one was living in them, which kind of suggests that the supply was in excess of what the demand could support. We're not at the national level in a situation like that right now, but if people are leaving your town or city because of whatever it might be, because of the pandemic, because a major employer left the town, that will have an influence on what's going on in your market. And then the other thing that people do if they're a buyer right now, because I can understand a buyer being nervous about making such a big purchase when prices are so high that, they don't want to find themselves, in a home they can't afford down the road. They don't want to find themselves dealing with the issues that people dealt with, where they suddenly owed more on their mortgage than their home was worth because of the last housing market crash. So, saving as much as possible for your down payment is critical. Mm-hmm. Obviously, that's not something you can change overnight, but as one financial expert I spoke with for another story I did this week, cautioned, was she was saying, your down payment is your buffer against all sorts of issues. It's your buffer against, if your home's value drops, 5%, but you put a 10% down payment there, that's going to give you something of a financial cushion so that you're not suddenly, in the hole for more than, your home is now worth. Similarly, like, let's say you buy a home and then 3 years later you need to turn around and sell because your job was relocated to, Minnesota from, Florida, and you suddenly have to move. Well, if you put down a larger down payment, you're going to give yourself a better shot at actually, making a profit off of the sale of your home. Because keep in mind, when you sell a home, there are all the costs that the seller has to take on, yep. The realtor's fees, etc. So those could add up to anywhere from like 5 to 7% of the home's value. So if you only put a 3% down payment down, you in the first few years of paying off your mortgage, you're not actually building up too much equity, because in the start of the mortgage payments, you're paying off more of the interest than the principal. So, you may only have built up to 6% equity. Well, if your, costs come to 6%, then, you're at least not losing money, but you're not getting any sort of benefit from it either. So, you're not getting extra money that you could put towards the purchase of your next home. So the larger the down payment you can do, the better. But also keep in mind a larger down payment will reduce your monthly costs on your mortgage and things like that. That being said, keep money in savings for the rainy day when suddenly you lose your job, as a lot of people experienced during this pandemic, and you on top of the mortgage you've got taxes, homeowners insurance, etc. So make sure you have funds set aside to cover all that. But to the extent that you can, the larger the down payment you can make, the better.
Yeah, definitely a good rule of thumb. Really important lessons. I think we might be getting closer back to that 20% down rule of thumb that I kind of grew up in and my parents grew up with. Jacob Passy, we're going to leave it there. Always a pleasure chatting with you. Great conversation. Have a great rest of the weekend, and we'll chat with you again. I can't talk next week, my friend. Welcome back, and now time to take a look at what's going on Capitol Hill. And, well, there's a lot going on these days, lots of bills, lots of talk about infrastructure. Joining us on the line, of course, they're better known as the Legal Eagles, but we also know them as David Levine and Kevin Walsh. Both are principals with Groom Law Group, an employee benefits law firm based in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, how are we today?
We are doing well, Jeff. And bills is a big thing because after a while of not caring about, budget deficits, it seems to be becoming back into vogue to care about deficit spending and how do you pay for it. And of course, anytime you have a discussion of deficit spending or how to pay for things, what's one of the most favorable things that people just grab off the shelf to pay for it? Retirement. Yep. So that's our topic today. But I defer to my wise colleague, Mr. Walsh, to dive in on that.
Yeah, I thought Jeff said it perfectly at the beginning, which is, there's a lot of talk about bills in D.C., and I think it's both a talk about bills and how do you pay for those bills. Because we all know that you can only get bills accruing for so long before you've got to start paying them. And as we look at a potential infrastructure package in D.C., where they're throwing around numbers like, just north of $2 trillion, I think one of the key questions for everyone is, how are they gonna pay for this if they want to pay for it? And the message out of the Biden administration seems to be no tax increases for families making more than $400,000 a year. And honestly, if you narrow the base to a point where you're only looking at those who are making north of $400,000 a year, you need to get creative with some of the ways you're going to pay for legislation. And one thing that we keep hearing might be on the table is making changes to the retirement system that could have an impact on long-term savings. So today I'm going to highlight three possible changes that I've heard discussed in DC that could make some sort of an impact on the amount of money that people have in retirement. The first thing is just capping the amount of money that someone's allowed to have in a retirement plan, in a 401k plan, a 403b plan, in an individual, in an account designed for saving for retirement. So right now the idea is that there's a cap on how much you're allowed to contribute each year, but there's no cap on the amount of earnings you can get on that, and there's no cap on kind of how much that can grow to get you to and through a secure retirement. So what we've been hearing a little bit is some discussion that accounts above a certain threshold, and the number I've heard is $3 million. And if this thing moves forward, it's all likely to change. Would you'd be required to take distributions on amounts above that, or you would no longer get the same tax advantages for savings above that threshold. Mm-hmm. The second thing that we've been hearing is there's a 162M expansion, and everyone loves it when you throw out numbers followed by letters. But the idea here is that when you provide, when you compensate your highest compensated employees, you would, lose some of the tax advantages associated with, making those payments. And this is kind of an attractive thing for Democrats at times because it hits the highest earners at a company. And they've used it a couple times already where it's expanded from, basically a handful of individuals to a slightly larger handful of individuals. And, with each piece of legislation, there's some temptation to say, we're going to expand it to a slightly larger group of highly compensated individuals. the third real thing that we've heard bandied about, and this was actually brought up back in when the Republicans were doing the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act very early on, was the idea that, right now you can save for retirement two ways. You can either contribute money before you pay taxes on it, and in that case you get, tax-free earnings on it, but when you take distributions in retirement, it's treated like ordinary income. Or you can pay taxes today, get tax-free earnings on it, and not be taxed on the way out. So the pay taxes today, don't get taxed again, is considered like the Roth savings way versus the traditional way of saving. And one of the interesting things about how we budget as a country is we treat money that's taxed today as getting taxed for budget purposes, but we treat money that's not getting taxed for more than 10 years as never getting taxed. So when we look at this on paper, we think, oh my gosh, if we were to tax everybody today in exchange for not taxing them in the future, that makes us a whole lot of money over the long run. And it's a quirk of our budgeting. But the idea of pushing retirement savers to be taxed now in exchange for not being taxed later has come up in a handful of bills, and we wouldn't be surprised to see it at least discussed early on in the infrastructure package. David, do you want to jump in and talk a little bit more about these? And in all likelihood, these proposals could all get cut by the wayside as pressures come in to find different pay-fors. But David, what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Kevin. I thought that was really good. So I'm not going to add that much. I do want to admit, though, as a bit of levity, I enjoyed the sound effects Kevin planned for today, because doing these types of savings, it's like a game of ping pong, and you heard the beeping, and he thought ahead and actually planned because he was moving backwards and forwards in his car in a parking space. You could hear the little beeping, and that's exactly right as to how it's going to work. Because during this time, I think Kevin nails it. There's all these little intricacies. Roth is a well that's been gone to many times, but it comes in, it comes out. Even in the
it's not like
ARPA.
It's not like moving a car forward and backward, David. I agree with you.
Yeah, and ARPA, for instance, originally there was talk about there was a version of it where you would have capped the amount of you would have capped different contributions and benefit plans. The key takeaway on that is that this will always come back every time that we are looking for money, because retirement and health, when you put the two together, are such big tax incentives other than like mortgage deduction that they're always going to be top of list. The state and local tax deduction already got hit in 2017, although there's a push to bring it back. So we're always going to be up there. But Jeff, we've had a long enough segment, and I have to admit, we're going to try to keep going with the sound effects. So I think this was a great segment. So thanks for having us.
Yeah. Let me back up for a second, then we can move forward. What would be, just real quick, any change to the retirement system in any way, I think, could be deleterious have a negative impact, I should say, to saving. Would you expect that the various constituencies are already on the phone or I guess it can't be in person, maybe they can, on Zoom, trying to explain how this could negatively impact the retirement savings rate, which is already in a precarious position?
I can say simply,
Jeff,
yes. There's the answer. Yes.
Well, and Jeff, to be honest though, I mean, when we go into these discussions and when the government's trying to find ways to raise revenue, everybody's hoping that somebody else's ox gets gored. But if they need revenue, I think they recognize there's going to be a deleterious effect. But it's how do you do it in a way that causes the least impact? And I think David and I think the retirement system is a bad vehicle for raising revenue.
Yep.
In light of the social good that it does, but it's a fight that we have to make every time that there's a need to get more funds.
Yeah. Hey, well, Kevin, I just like the answer yes. I thought that was easier, but yes, I agree with you.
All right.
I just like using the ox. I just like every time there's a tax discussion, it's basically the only time you get to use someone's ox is getting gored. Yeah.
Fine.
You never get to use that in day-to-day life.
Fine, I'm going to take advantage of this, and just for our future, for one of our future Eagles segments, I think what we're going to do is we're going to have like big word and like cliche day, where we talk about deleterious. We're going to talk about
David, the tax system. The goal is get as many feathers with as little squawking.
Hey, Kevin, don't be my frenemy, okay? Let's just keep going here.
Well, gentlemen, always a pleasure chatting with you. You did not gore my ox, but someone else's ox may be gored. I want to wish you a very nice weekend. Thanks so much for joining us on the program, and we look forward to having you back again next week.
Thanks so much, Jeff.
Bye.
Thanks, Kevin. Bye.
Bye, guys. Well, that wraps up this episode of BRN Sunday. Have a topic of interest, someone you think we should talk to, then drop us a line. And don't forget, for all the information in retirement markets technology, personal finance, so much more, all in one place, check out today's edition of our daily newsletter, The Morning Pulse, and of course, our website. We're back again tomorrow for BRN AM. So until then, I'm Jeff Snyder. Stay safe, keep on saving, and don't forget, roll with the changes.